This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Photographing the West podcast, brought to you by Flanagan Photos. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. This is episode number 47. I'm very pleased to have back Canadian wildlife photographer Brad Hill. Brad is well known for his wildlife photography and his Nikon gear reviews. To learn more about Brad, listen to podcast number 17 on August 15, 2017. Welcome back, Brad.
Hi, Kirby. It's good to be back.
Good to have you. So please introduce yourself briefly for those who don't know you or haven't listened to last year's podcast.
Sure. I've been a professional wildlife photographer now since, I guess, way back in 2005. So that makes it 13 years. And have sort of lived through the whole revolution of cameras from the film days right up to the digital era, and now deeply into the digital era. I'm originally a biologist, studied evolutionary biology as it applies to animal behavior, and always was into photography, and then I took a stint in the high-tech sector. So in some respects, I sort of came pre-adapted for the digital wildlife photography world. And as you know, I tend to be a little on the technical side, which is, I think, almost an essential these days, and with where we're going with digital photography and wildlife photography in general. So that's a nutshell.
Okay, good. We're both Nikon shooters, so I thought it'd be fun to discuss some of the recent new gear from Nikon. There's been a bunch. Let's start with the Z7. What are your thoughts after using it for a while?
Well, in Canada, we have Z7, so it's not quite like your Z7.
Okay. Is that Nikon approved, or?
It's English language approved. I took delivery of my 7 pretty much when everyone else did, a couple weeks back, and I've been shooting with it ever since, and that's included a lot of a whole mix of things, really. Some very rigid testing, as well as a lot of just plain shooting, testing out different scenarios, playing with the various autofocus modes, going through it pretty thoroughly. And I'm about 5,000 images in right now, and pretty impressed with the camera. It's not perfect like any camera, but by the same token, it's an incredibly nice camera to complement other cameras you may have in Nikon's line.
Sounds great. Now, when it first came out, everybody seemed to want to bash it for one thing or another, particularly for only having one card slot. For me, I don't think it's a big deal, but unless you're a wedding photographer, maybe. But what do you think?
Well, it's interesting. That's one that I've actually now seen Nikon address this one directly themselves, and I have to admit that as a wildlife photographer, I tend to share the same view you do, that most wildlife photographers that I'm aware of, and as you know, I lead photo tours and encounter hundreds per year, most wildlife photographers tend to use the second slot as an overflow. And to be honest, with the size of cards people are running these days, very few of them tend to use that overflow. And so for many wildlife photographers, I think it's a non-issue. And Nikon's view when they're discussing it is one that, you know, they felt they had the trade-off is going with the second card slot will enlarge the camera somewhat. And so with that, combined with the reliability of the XQD media, they're arguing that it's really not necessary, and keeping the camera small was a bigger concern. I'm not bothered at all personally by having the one camera, the one card slot. I see that there might be some, especially those who've shot primarily SD cards throughout their life, that feel that they need a secondary card for a backup while they're shooting. Again, it's not a big concern for me, but I can understand where others, you know, aren't that thrilled about it. But I've never yet seen an XQD card fail in the field. So I'm not saying it can't happen, but I think it's pretty rare compared to some of the older storage media that were used.
Yeah, it's interesting that they've stuck with the XQD card when it came out, I was wondering if they were on the wrong track, but apparently they had a long-term vision of what they were going to do with it. Unfortunately, it stayed very expensive, which I guess the size is large enough now that you don't really need a lot of them unless you're doing a heck of a lot of shooting. But let me ask you another question. Are you familiar with the other type of card that they're coming out with, which is
CF Express?
Yeah, that's it, right.
Uh, well, I haven't shot with it yet. I think very few people have. I assume it's at the testing stage right now, or hardly any of them out there at this point. You know how I am. I tend to not really base many judgments solely on specifications, and I really want to try it myself in the field to see how it holds up. I'm perfectly happy at this point. Of course, I'd like them cheaper, but I'm perfectly happy with the reliability, size, and certainly the speed of the XQD cards. So I'll keep an open mind towards them, but at this point, I really have no gems of knowledge on the CF Express. So.
My Z7 is supposed to arrive today. Unfortunately, I didn't get mine as early as you did, but my only concern so far is the weatherproofing, and I've recently seen some pretty good reviews on it, but I was wondering what your experience was.
Well, so far, that's one of these things that you don't know till you know. What I mean by that is that I've seen many people think that they've got a DSLR that's virtually indestructible with respect to rain and moisture, and then they take it with me on a trip into the Great Bear Rainforest, and for the first time ever, it fails. So I haven't taken a shower yet with my Z7. And so far it seems fine, and certainly the Nikon claims that the environmental sealing on it is at the D850 level, which is not far off the D5 level. And consequently, I'm fairly confident it's going to hold up well. And it's the build quality on the camera is very DSLR-ish. I had to say that carefully. Very DSLR-ish in the content, and I mean pro DSLR-ish in the context of just how solid everything's together. And they're claiming the weather sealing is there, and I have no reason at this point to disbelieve them. I have felt bad for them in a sense in terms of where they were, besides being hammered a little online for the one card slot, the other one, and I initially was shocked by this, is when I saw the number of images per charge on the batteries of, rated the CIPA or CIPA rating of 300 and some shots. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be having to carry a boatload of batteries with me. And in fact, I don't know how they make that test, but I'm finding I'm getting far in excess of 1,000 images per charge, more like 1,300 images per charge with my camera. And I'm fine with that, given you're using a little ENEL15B battery. So.
Right, and I think that's been the experience of others now too. So hopefully that's been put to rest.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the context of some things we don't know until we actually get the camera in the hand. And I commend Nikon in that case for sticking with reporting it as they're, in a sense, required to report that. But even if that reporting is beyond conservative in terms of what the real world charge length is on them, you normally expect it's not going to be as good as rated. I think we've all got used to the gasoline mileage estimates where we know we'll never attain that. Well, in this case, it's the exact opposite, that we exceed it by a large degree. And you can stretch it out even more depending on how you configure the camera. One example there is that you can have it set so that it operates almost like a DSLR in the context that when you bring the camera up to your eye, electronic viewfinder comes on, and then when you move it away, it doesn't instantly light up the LCD. It's just called prioritized viewfinder, and that'll extend your battery life. Yeah, so there's lots of little things you can do, and but I was getting 1,300 shots when I was even setting it up and playing with it, and yeah, the battery life is good on the camera.
Good to know. Do you have any recommendations for settings or optimum settings on the Z7?
Well, there's a few things in setup I'd I'd sort of caution people to be, not caution, but just little helpful hints. One of which is that, in a sense, there's a few less buttons on the camera, which instantly make people think, oh my God, in order to make a change a simple setting, I may have to dive deeply into a menu. But there's something new in the camera called the I button isn't new on the Nikon cameras, but what it does is new, and it's a consequence of having an electronic viewfinder, is when you're in shooting mode and you've hit that I button, you're presented with a small menu along the bottom of the electronic viewfinder as you're looking through it. And there's 12 different things you can access right there instantly through it. And those are all configurable. Each of the 12 could be one of a number of different settings. But the point I'm getting to is that if you're one that wants to set up the camera using various user settings, which are collected groups of settings that you can easily access simply by spinning the mode dial on the camera, you'll want to set up your menus associated with the I button first, and then not have to duplicate it on every single user setting you set up. It's something that, you realize that you can waste an extra hour of setting the camera up if you have to reconfigure that menu within the viewfinder in every different user setting. If you're not using user settings, it's not something that's critical. And that brings back up one other interesting point, is that anyone familiar with Nikon's professional DSLRs will realize that there's never been user settings on them. They've always had a combination of shooting banks, which are basically collections of things that are set in the shooting menu, and then custom banks. And the net result is that you could never tie in things like your autofocus settings, etc., into a shooting bank. And so they were of limited use. With user settings, virtually everything that you can set up on the camera can be tied into, not quite everything, but almost everything can be tied into a user setting. So you could have one set up for landscape photography, and you just simply turn that to U1, U2, or U3, whichever you choose to set it to. And it instantly shifts over everything from recording mode to your focus mode to everything you've set up for landscape photography. And you might have one set up for action shooting. And so it may be a different configuration of autofocus settings with a different higher shutter speed, etc. And it can be extremely useful if you set it up for your type of photography. So user settings are something that I've really liked all along, and they were common on cameras like the D750, the D600, but they were always absent from the professional Nikon cameras, and I was thrilled to see that user settings were included on this camera, and also on the Z6 or Z6.
Yeah, that's great. That's always been one of those things that everybody complained about on the D4, D5, and those level of cameras. So nice that they fixed that, and that's pretty clever having it available in the viewfinder. That's one of the advantages of mirrorless, I guess. Plus, having a real live histogram is going to be great, I think.
Yeah, I'm already really enjoying the live histogram. If one's into, some people are really into matrix metering. Others use center weighted or spot metering, and there's lots of different ways to use your camera, and I've always tended to use matrix metering, and I've really appreciated how it's improved over the years, and got quite good at looking at a scene and understanding before I even take the shot of how much I've got to under or overexpose based on how that particular camera's matrix metering works. But it's better when you've got a live histogram. The guesswork is coming out of it, or the effort of having to spend years getting the experience to understand how exposure works. And just seeing the histogram there is really helpful. And you've also got, just toggling through the display button while you're looking through the viewfinder. You can also have a virtual horizon there. And again, usually more useful when you're shooting landscape photography, but I don't know how many crooked horizons I've seen of bears swimming that have driven me crazy in the past. So having instant access to a virtual horizon is another great feature. So yeah. The I button, I think, though, with that extra menu that temporarily pops up when you hit the button is just fantastic. And I'll have to say that I prefer optical viewfinders. I go to some pretty amazing places to do my photography, and I don't like looking through what amounts to be, in a sense, you feel like you're looking through a 15-year-old TV. That all being said, boy, I'm enjoying the convenience of what I'm getting out of that electronic viewfinder, from that live histogram through to all the other features that can be adjusted, while you're looking through the viewfinder. It's pretty cool.
So going back to the weatherproofing for a second, do you recommend, or is it okay for me to bring my Z7 when I come up for my workshop with you guys?
Yes, it's definitely okay to bring your Z7, but like with any DSLR, if you're going to be shooting in a place that rain is a very common event, I definitely recommend putting it under a rain cover, just the way I recommend for DSLRs. And I've been doing that for, pushing 15 years of leading these tours almost. And yeah, we see people that just believe that their D5 or D4 or D3 is absolutely, or their Canon 1DX Mark II is absolutely waterproof, and next day crying when their camera isn't working after they've shot in the rain all day. And they're very weather resistant, but nothing's waterproof in terms of a land-based. I'm referring to, if it's not in Nikonos, you better be careful. So. Right. Yeah, I would definitely bring it the same way I'd bring any DSLR, but with all of them, I'd recommend rain covers in a moist environment if you're going to be shooting in that environment.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Any experience with the Z6 before we move on?
Not yet. For my style of shooting, a Z7 was a more desirable camera than the Z6 or Z6. I've really well covered in the 20 megapixel range or the 20 to 30 megapixel range with my DSLRs. And I think there, if you want to be shooting action, you're still going to find the DSLRs a little quicker cameras to deal with than the Z6. But other users, for the way I use my cameras, Z7 was of more interest to me, and so I won't be acquiring or testing a Z6.
Okay. Speaking of that, what about wildlife photography, like birds in flight? Is that reasonable to expect from the Z7, or grab your DSLR?
That's a great question, and it's a pretty complicated answer. I've been shooting action with my Z7, and I definitely have got some opinions on it, which I'm sure you're surprised by. The Z7, you're dealing with almost a 50 megapixel camera, just like the D850. And if you're shooting action on a regular basis, it's my view that nothing comes close to touching what a D5 will do. Probably the single camera that comes the closest in Nikon's line would be the D500 in terms of its frame rate. Autofocus isn't quite as good as the D5, but the D5 is just, that's what the camera's designed for. I find I'm getting a very similar hit rate in terms of the number of in-focus images I can manage with the Z7 compared to my D850. It's slightly lower on the Z7, but the gap between the usefulness of the Z7 as an action camera and a D850 is far smaller than either of those two and D5. So, the D5, you're moving into its terrain there in a major, major way. There's certainly some, and again, you're seeing a lot of this online. There's people complaining about the autofocus modes that are available in the Z7 and as well as going to be in the Z6 or Z6. I've got to get that terminology consistent. I have a hard time turning off my Canadianism on the Zs. With respect to the autofocus modes, one thing that people should realize right off the bat is it does not, to begin with, I've heard complaints about the fact that it doesn't have a group area autofocus. It doesn't only in the fact that they've renamed it. They've now got large zone, or they've got zone photography in it. So you've got, in a sense, one big focus area that more or less becomes a single focus point, just like in group area with the Nikon DSLRs. You've got two sizes of it, small and large, and it works the exact same way the group area does. That is to say, it prioritizes on focusing on the closest thing within that zone, which is exactly how group area works. So you do have that, and it works, in my view, equally effectively as it does with the group area, but you've got two different sizes to choose from, which is nice in that one downfall of group area mode and when you're shooting action is if you have any foreground in that frame, it's going to nab the foreground and focus on that and not focus on your subject. So that's something to keep in mind. When it comes to focus tracking, it really depends on the type of photography you do. I know of very few wildlife photographers that work with the 3D group area mode, where basically you're using the entire focusing array and just holding the camera static and letting the subject cross it. In most cases, people are panning and using some of their smaller dynamic area modes, like the it could be the 72 point if you're dealing with a D5 or a D500 or a D850 for that matter. Those sorts of configurations, 25 point. They do have the 9-point AF mode or 9-point dynamic area on the Z7, and it's a much larger 9-point spread or area than on the D5 and the D850. So I'm finding it quite useful for panning. Now the other wild card in this whole issue with respect to shooting action, of course, is a combination of two things. One is frame rate, well, three things. Frame rate, your burst size, and your blackout time. And all those, so a high frame rate, a deep burst size, and a very short blackout time make it easier and more effective to shoot things like birds in flight or mammals running, those sorts of things. You're going to find that if you're going to shoot with a audible shutter, not in silent shutter mode and not in the continuous advanced or the high-speed expanded mode, you're limited to 5.5 frames per second on the Z7 and on the Z6, or sorry, the Z7, Z6. And you're limited to 5.5 frames a second. So that's going to slow you down a little bit in terms of your action mode. Blackout time, you're going to find it longer than on either the D5 or the D500 or for that matter, the D850. Burst size is going to be a bit variable depending upon the format you're shooting in. I'm getting about 30 to 32 frames shooting 14-bit RAW. It'll also depend a bit on the complexity of your scene. So those are all wild cards. The net result is that no, these aren't going to challenge a D5 quite yet in terms of shooting action, but they're workable. You know, you can at times get incredibly sharp action shots with these cameras. Your hit rate won't be as high as the best DSLRs, but they're still pretty darn good at it. If we went back a generation or two of DSLR, you'd be right there with respect to competing for in-action shooting. The only other point I'd make is that on this is that the camera, both cameras, the Z7 and the Z6, have a high-speed frame rate. They call it high-speed expanded, or extended rather. That removes the blackout time, but it's very hard to use for action in that it's like a freeze frame movie. No blackout time, but you're getting a sequence of flickering images that are the images like you hit instantly playback mode for a second. And so you've got this herky-jerky looking group of almost like slow motion video going on through your viewfinder, and that's really tough to work with on the action. If you've got a static subject and you want to photograph a bird moving its head left and right, or you know, that sort of thing, it works perfectly. However, if you're trying to pan with it, it's problematic.
Oh, okay. I hadn't heard that before. I guess it's good that you're able to get shots in the 30 range with 14-bit, because that's another thing that people complain about is the lack of a deep buffer. So apparently that isn't as big a problem as some people make it out to be.
Again, depends a little bit on how you're shooting. If you're shooting JPEG fines plus RAW, you're going to find that number go down. I conducted a group of tests shooting just 14-bit RAWs, and the range was very small in terms. I changed scene types, and I was between 30 and 32 images in each case. After 10 trials, it was coming out very consistent. And then you hit it hard, and then that's at its fastest rate. It still continues to shoot, but it slows down dramatically. It just starts chugging along.
I wonder if the problem is the rate of transfer from the buffer to the card, or which might improve with the CFast cards, or if it's inherent in the buffer itself.
Well, I think it's the amount of data being transferred. It's this
Sure.
Again, we're looking at files here that are D850 sized exactly, not D5 sized. And I think you're dealing with a data transfer rate issue. The D5 is superb, but they're much small. You get 200, you basically get 200 shots in a burst with that in the D500, which, by the way, those are mechanically governed. If you let your finger off the shutter for even half a second and go back on those cameras, it'll shoot another 200. It's not a buffering issue there. But with respect to the file sizes, these burst rates I'm getting aren't dramatically smaller than on a D850. They're a little smaller, but they're not dramatically smaller. And I think it's just a data transfer issue. There's just, regardless of how fast a card you have, you can only move it through, you got to find a limiting point in the pipeline, the data transfer pipeline. And I think it's, camera to card. So there's something in that pipeline. But it's still pretty amazing when you think of what we're doing with both the D850 and this Z7 in terms of the number of images we can shoot, high resolution images we can shoot in, over time. I'm still kind of blown away with what the D850 can do, and also what the Z7 can do.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that 45 or megabyte images are now becoming pretty routine. Who would have thought it a few years ago?
Yeah, and one other point I'd make, by the way, a lot of people are interested in the comparison between the D850 and the Z7 images, and I have done a lot of very systematic ISO testing comparing them. And if you're looking at both luminosity and color noise, I can find no difference whatsoever between the cameras. The noise is virtually identical. I can't really comment directly on dynamic range, how it varies with your ISO, and if it's the same between the two cameras, but I have no reason to believe that it won't be equally as good as the D850 files in that regard. And certainly Nikon's claiming it's going to be as good or better when those tests come out. And again, I have no reason to disbelieve them in what I'm seeing from the images. The images are beautiful, by the way. And the other thing we haven't touched on, and this is one thing that I was extremely curious about with the whole Z series cameras, was this new Z mount, and what Nikon was claiming about what it would allow them to do with the optics of the lenses that are built for it. The big thing really was the space between the back of the lens and the sensor. That gap was reduced significantly, as well as the fact that it's a bigger opening, and it's going to allow them to have faster lenses. And they're claiming they're going to be able to produce sharper lenses edge to edge. And it's one of these things that seems logical, but you're wondering if it's true. And I got my hands, when I got my Z7, I got it with the 24-70 f4S. And I have two other 24-70s to compare against, because I do have the FTZ. I've got the FTZ mount adapter. So I basically had the three, in a sense, top Nikon mount-based 24-70s to compare. And so I've spent some time doing a lot of comparison shooting of them on a tripod under very rigid, all with shooting live view, silent shutter, cable release, bolted down on a tripod. And I'm finding the new 24-70 f4S lens, the Z mount one, is actually sharper than their 24-70 f2.8E f mount lens, and a little sharper than the other strong competitor in that field is the Sigma 24-70 f2.8 Art, which is a great lens as well. But so far the promise of the Z mount that I've seen on at least this one lens is being fulfilled. It's really a sharp lens, which is really nice to see, because these wide angle zooms, they can be tough to work with.
Especially good news at that price point.
Yeah, I was surprised, because you think of it a little bit as a kit lens, and you sort of have a negative feeling that, oh, it's a kit lens, it won't compete with the best of the best. And certainly at this point, it's competing very well in terms of, landscape shooting and that. Yes, it's an f4 versus an f2.8 lens, but that being said, it's, with my type as a nature and wildlife photographer, I'm usually trying to look for, stopping these lenses down to maximize my depth of field, as opposed to shooting them wide open. I won't say the same with my big telephoto lenses, but that being said, with this lens, it's more one I shoot, stop down, and this 24 to 70 Z mount lens is performing extremely well. And I have to admit, I'm pleasantly surprised that it's performing as well as it is.
Any other thoughts about the Z7 before we move on?
Well, something that I was excited about, I wrote about it on my blog as well, that it was something that excited me and is proving actually to fulfill its promise so far, is imparting vibration reduction on third-party lenses or on non-VR f-mount lenses. So if you're using the FT-Z adapter, you of course can use virtually any f-mount lens. And if it's a non-VR lens, because the image stabilization in this camera is based in the body, it will impart VR on your non-VR lenses. And I've got a few of those that get much less use than, that are basically limited to being shot off of tripods normally. But with the FT-Z adapter and using it on the Z7, by having it imparting VR on non-VR lenses, I'm finding them more useful. And so that to me is a huge thing. So I've got a few lenses that I'm all of a sudden they're with me every day, where before it would be like, well, I have to haul my tripod and blah, blah, blah. And, now all of a sudden those lenses have become more useful. So I'm pretty stoked about that.
Yeah, good news. Well, we probably ought to spend a little time talking about the Nikon 180 to 400 millimeter lens that you've reviewed extensively. It's probably out of the price range of most folks, and it's certainly out of my price range. But you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, that's a lens that made me eat my words a little bit, and in a sense, I guess I'm glad I had to. But for those that may not know, the lens is in a sense thought of as a replacement for the next version of the Nikon's, in a sense, almost venerable 200 to 400 VR zoom, which had been around for a number of years, and it had a couple iterations even after the VR was introduced. And it's funny because, as you indicated, this is an extremely expensive lens. In Canada and the US, we're talking a 5-figure lens, like in the $14,000 range in the US, and a little more than that in Canada. If you, after conversion, it's about the same. Currency conversion, it's about the same. But basically, it's a lens that you look at it is functionally almost doubled in price since the day it was called the 200 to 400. Now they've of course integrated a teleconverter into it, so it becomes a 180 to 560 millimeter lens. And I was just shocked at the price when I first saw the lens and couldn't understand how Nikon could, ask that kind of price for what was supposedly, at least in my mind, a descendant of the 200 to 400. And as you know, I tested it extensively against just a huge array of lenses, and I have to say it just blew me away how good the lens was. There's a few things it does that I've never seen in any lens whatsoever. The first is I've tested lenses for years, and I've never found a lens that was as sharp, wide open, as it is when you stop it down 2/3 to a full stop. So that includes the best of the best lenses, Nikon's 400 millimeter f2.8e, the new and I do think this is a fantastic lens, the new 770 to 200 f2.8e lens. These are the ones with fluorine elements. even despite how good those lenses are, they have to be stopped down a little to get to maximum sharpness, especially on the edges. Not so with the 180-4. It's the only lens I've ever seen at every focal length on the lens that it's as sharp wide open, including when the teleconverter is engaged, as it is when you stop down, which is, it means you truly have, if you don't have the teleconverter engaged, an f4 lens that you can shoot at f4 and get absolutely tack sharp images. And it's you can shoot it with the teleconverter engaged at f5.6 without the need to stop it down to 6.3 or 7.1 to get sharp images. It's just stunning in that regard. The other thing that blew me away is that I've never yet seen a Nikon zoom, or for that matter, a Canon zoom, where it doesn't have some weak point optically within its focal range. So in the 180-400 in Nikon lenses, traditionally they were at their weakest optically. I'm not saying bad, but they're weakest optically at their longest focal length. That's just not the case with the 180-400. It's just absolutely tack sharp at 400 millimeters, or for that matter, at 560. I read an early review of the 180-400 that from Europe that indicated that you should only use the teleconverter as a last resort, and I'm not sure if they had a bad lens or what, but I have not experienced that whatsoever, that the teleconverter is producing lenses pretty much prime sharp. And so, I was quite negative about the lens in terms of where it fit in pricing wise, but now I can't imagine going on a trip and not having that lens with me. It's just so versatile. But what a price tag,
Yeah,
but
indeed.
But they are selling. I anticipated them just, they were good. They did start off a little slowly because I think the initial sticker shock, but once the independent reviews started coming out, not so much the ones from Nikon's own people, but the independent reviews started coming out. People were going, wow, this is an incredible lens. And yeah, it can replace a lot of lenses in your kit if you're a wildlife photographer and have some big primes. It can actually replace some of those big primes and end up looking, and if you look at it that way, you look at what it can replace, the price doesn't seem quite so bad. If you're replacing a, $12,000 prime, one or two, $10,000 plus prime lenses, it doesn't look so bad anymore.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I tried to talk myself into that, but didn't quite succeed, I guess.
When I was testing it, I was trying to talk myself out of it because I didn't want to have to fork out the money, or keep it forked out for the lens. But I can't imagine giving the lens up now for what I do. Yeah.
So you went ahead and bought it after all, huh?
Well, I bought it. I don't get lenses free for testing. I buy lenses and test them. And then if I don't like them, I sell them. It's something that I don't want people giving me products to test. There's things that go with that that I don't want to. I want to. My objectivity and credibility is on the line if I end up receiving these things for free to test. No, I buy them and then I test them.
Well, before we close, we ought to spend some time talking about the new Nikon 500 millimeter PF lenses. Mine's still on order. Have you gotten yours yet?
No. In Canada, that lens is up there with the Holy Grail in terms of ability to find it. They're not around much in Canada yet. I don't know what's gone on there. I've heard speculation one way or the other, but it's a lens that's not really getting out in Canada yet. There's certainly some people in the US have got them, including non-NPS members have got them. And so they are out there, but the production numbers seem to be quite low. But like I say, almost impossible to get in Canada. And certainly it's a lens that many people are very excited about. And the dominating factor there, of course, is just how small it is. When you've got a lens that's really not much bigger than the 70-200 2.8, yet it's a 500 millimeter lens, it has obvious appeal in terms of ability to carry it most anywhere. So that's an obvious thing. And as we both know, the pricing on it isn't as, it's not in the stratosphere the way the 180 to 400 was or is. So I think between the size of that lens and of course its price point, I think they're going to sell like hotcakes when they actually ship them in real numbers.
Yeah.
But in real numbers, it's going to be absolutely selling like hotcakes. And I certainly have talked to many people who have shot them already, who got them, and so far I'm hearing nothing but positive. I tend to not judge a lens until I actually have it in my hands. I have my own concerns about its usefulness for where I shoot, but it's, that's not to say that others won't find it extremely useful. So yeah, my concern stems from the fact that I work in low light an awful lot of the time, more than your average wildlife photographer. That's largely driven off the fact that I work often on Canada's mid and northern coast, which is often quite overcast and in deep forest. And consequently, a lens that starts at f5.6, like the new 500 millimeter does, I'm not saying it won't be of use to me, but it will probably be one that I won't be able to use as frequently as someone shooting in brighter light. Say someone shooting in the desert Southwest, as an example, or Africa shooters. Well, basically anyone who doesn't shoot where I shoot might find that it a little more useful. And my concern on it too, and this is something it may be perfectly fine in this regard, but I want to judge it once I have the lens in my hand, is if I'm getting a lens that's an f5.6 maximum aperture, it has to be tack sharp at f5.6 because I'll have to be shooting it at f5.6 a fair amount. And the other issue I'm concerned about is compared to a 500 f4 is, do you have the ability to really isolate a subject from the background with a limited depth of field, because you gain more depth of field with an f5.6 lens compared to an f4 shot at their maximum apertures. So we'll see how it pans out. I'm very excited about getting mine. I'm hopeful that Nikon also does before long, because this lens would interest me more, is I hope they do come out with the 600 5.6 PF lens. So,
Well, we'll see. It'll be probably priced in the stratosphere like the others, but talking
well, the
about
PFs so far have been more reasonable,
right,
so
right, true.
We'll see. I expect it'll be a premium over the 500, but it won't be anything like their fluorine lenses.
So I'm curious, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the phase Fresnel lenses?
Well, the one is obvious, is that they're just tiny, compared to their non-phase Fresnel competitors, so to speak. As an example, the 300 millimeter f4 PF, that's become a standby for me as a walk around lens when I'm hiking around my cabin. It's just, so small, so tiny. And that's allowed by the PF, the phase Fresnel, I can hardly talk, technology, just like the DO lenses from Canon. And there's very few DOs. The 400 DO comes to mind. But it's that small size, and that is becoming huge to traveling photographers. It's this issue as airlines become increasingly less tolerant about or more restrictive about baggage, that carry-on can only be this heavy, et cetera. And, regulations aren't the same across the board, but we're running into it in the northern coast in BC a lot, where we've got to be very careful about our total weight, and they weigh every piece of carry-on, which is a little bit really, stretches things a lot. Now, that being said, there's some optical compromises. One that has got a lot of press, but I don't find it much of a problem in practice, at least with my 300 PF, and I hope not with the 500 when mine arrives, is the specular highlights being a little bit sort of donut shaped, or, you get a little bit of an extra ring on them. I've rarely found, even shooting on, reflective water, that's much of an issue with the lens. It's purported to be, Nikon, in fairness, was good about announcing it when they announced the lens, but the 300 PF that is, but I've found it to rarely be a problem. The absolute resolution and or sharpness the lens can produce is something that I think you will find their traditional non-PF lenses, probably very slightly sharper if you shoot them under extremely controlled conditions with a high resolution camera. So in this case, a D850 or a Z7 may reveal differences in sharpness. But in practice, this is almost like comparing MTF curves on a lens and judging it on MTF curves alone, which is something I always protest to, because most of the time in the field, we're not shooting with the precision that are going to allow us to approach that MTF value anyways. And, there's other things that are going to interfere with us getting to that point. And so in terms of the realized sharpness you get out of the lens, I'm hoping the 500 won't be that different than the 500 PF won't be much different than what you'd get out of the Nikkor 500 millimeter f4e, or for that matter, the Sigma Sport 500 millimeter, which is another really good lens. So
the MTF curves look pretty impressive, I'd have to say, and I don't usually pay attention to those, but
yeah, well, you know what? It's my view that you really have to take those with a grain of salt, because three other things really impact on how close you're going to be able to approach those MTF values in the field. Number one is the autofocus of your cameras. If you're not focusing deadly accurate, you're not going to approach those MTF values anyways. And yes, you might have an advantage on a mirrorless camera, especially if you're using it in contrast detect mode, if you haven't taken the pains to tune your lens. And AF tuning, I think most people would agree, although few admit it, is the biggest pain in the butt, especially with zoom lenses. The question becomes what distance and what focal length do you tune them at? And it becomes just a can of worms that most people would like to avoid. And this is one of the appeals of the mirrorless systems, is that you can avoid this fine tuning issue. But getting back to the point, so if your camera, that's the first thing that's going to influence whether or not you can get close to approaching in the field. The second is are you hand holding that lens? Well, with a 500 millimeter PF, you're likely going to be hand holding that lens the majority of the time. It's the size of a 70-200. And that's one of the appeals of the lens. And what's the quality of the VR system? Is it going to allow you to get an image as sharp as if you were bolted down on a tripod shooting with a cable release? That's another issue. So, and the last one is simply coming down to the balance of the system, is that, lightweight is nice, but I think you'll find that it's not the whole thing that really goes into determining how sharp an image you can get. Is often balance is more important than is weight. Perfect example is I can hand hold my 400 millimeter f2.8e when the VR is off, down to a slower shutter speed than I can hand hold my 300 millimeter PF, which is a fraction of the weight, but I have no mass to work against. So it's like holding up a piece of a styrofoam cup. Your hand shakes. It's just too light. And that comes down to a kind of a combination of lightness and balance. So when we factor in autofocus, VR ability or capabilities, and lens weight and balance, these things all determine, and those are going to vary between users in terms of how effective they are at getting the most out of each of those variables. Those are all going to impact on how closely you can get to your MTF values in the field. MTF values have a value in terms of absolute maximum theoretical sharpness, but we just don't get there in most cases in the field. So you have to look at real world use. And that's what I always attempt to do in the field testing I do, is look at what do these really translate into in a field use. And sure, if you're going to bolt them down, but that's, bolt them down and do everything perfect in the field, but that's not the way most of us actually use our gear, especially if you come on a photo tour with me and you're shooting out of the Zodiac.
Right. Well, who would have thought that we'd ever have to worry about a lens being too light, huh?
Well, it actually, some users it may not be that way, but and everyone's different in terms of what they can and can't handhold. But we'll see. The 500 PF is really promising. I'm looking forward to getting mine, and we'll see if it earns its place in my kit or not. That'll be the thing that determined for me, is if it really is something that can replace other products I already have.
Well, we probably ought to wrap it up, I guess. Thanks for being on again, Brad. It's been great talking to you once again. Tell everybody where they can find you and all the things you do, including testing gear and taking some pretty spectacular wildlife images.
Well, the easiest way is just Google my name, Brad Hill. You'll get to my website real quick, which is naturalart.ca. I am actually trying to continue my resistance to Facebook and all sorts of other social media. I'm sticking with the www for now. So yeah, you can find me just under naturalart.ca or just Google my name, Brad Hill, and you'll get there and you'll find all, as you know, my website tends to be updated very regularly, and it's got a lot of gear information and a whole lot of images in it. So feel free to jump in there. And yeah, and you probably are aware, I know you're aware, that one of the things we do in a big way is photo tours. So, and a lot of those, the big draw is the fact that many of them are instructional photo tours that people love. So they love going out there and getting a lot of hands-on instruction while working with some of the greatest wildlife you can find anywhere. So.
Yep, I'm definitely looking forward to my tour.
That sounds great. I'm looking forward to having you out.
So thanks for listening to another episode of Photographing the West. Do me a favor and leave us a review on iTunes. Show notes, as always, are on my website at www.flanagan, Flanagan, photos, spelled Photos.com. And we'll talk very soon. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.